Hello, hello everyone! Welcome to my first little lesson. Today, I'm going to be teaching you how to do shapes. And you know, it's serious when you pull out the little white blocks on everything. I decided to start doing these little lessons because I've been requested to do little art lessons for a long time, and I think I can do it in a fun and interesting way that works really well for people who are just starting out, and for people who just kind of want to immediately jump into drawing. But I do need to go through a little bit of fundamentals first, before immediately hopping into character design, because everybody wants to do character designs. Everyone wants to draw their favorite little cartoon character or their OC and stuff like that, which is very fun. You do need to know just a little bit of fundamentals first before jumping immediately into character design. So I'm not going to spend too much time on just little white blocks, but I do want everyone to be able to keep in mind when creating your own characters these very basic understandings of shape and looking at still lifes and stuff like that, and how to find shapes within still lifes. So we're going to go into this in basically two parts. The first part will be shapes. Shapes. Yay, shapes. The second part will be still lifes and how to work with them. And then we're going to get into shape, story, and language. I have notes. I forgot to pull up my notes. There we go. Then we're going to talk about shape, language, and then we're going to have some real examples of how shape language is used in TV shows and stuff like that. Let's get started with shapes. Whenever you are looking at a still life, everything is going to have a basic shape to it. I want to get started with looking at some of these. And it might not look like much, and a lot of people get very frustrated when looking at these of just it's not colorful, it's not interesting, why would I want to draw a bunch of white shapes? But the point of these is to understand how lighting affects different shapes. All of the lighting for each one of those is coming from this direction, and especially more complicated shapes like this one, it's very important to know where the lighting is kind of coming from, and how to understand the shape on its own. So when doing a still life, one of my first kind of tips for beginners is to take a photo of whatever the still life is that you want to practice on, print it out so that you can trace over top of the image. And I know the internet is very scary when it comes to the word trace, but as long as you are not tracing anything that is being sold, and that you are being very transparent that you did trace it specifically with art that was created by somebody else that you are tracing just to get the pose of. We will talk about poses later, but just in general, credit the artist for the pose that you are referencing or taking reference from. But for a photograph that you took yourself, you do not need to credit anything. But you're right now, for still lives, understanding how shapes sit in a space. The only reason that I am giving that as a tip to do for still lives specifically. So you have your photograph of whatever it is. So you've gone through and you've kind of traced the photograph of the items. And now you're just okay, now I have that. What do I do now? So the whole point of tracing them is to find the shapes. So you're looking at it, it's just like, oh, okay, this is like a circle, this is like a cylinder, and whatever. And specifically when it comes to shapes that are a little bit wonky of like, I'm not sure exactly how to draw this. Like, I can literally draw out like the lines that are on it, but I don't understand like what's really going on here. The best thing that you can do is understand it as a cylinder and as a circle. And that is what we are doing right now with tracing your still lifes, is that you are looking for shapes that are a little bit more complicated that you don't completely understand, and figuring out what you can relate it to. So this one is just a cylinder, like the other one. It's just a little bit more complicated. This one is just a circle, just a little bit more complicated. So what do we do once that we have them kind of traced out? I understand that this is more like a cylinder, but it's more complicated. Now what do I do? You start figuring out like where the shadows show flat faces. So both of these have very clear flat faces to them. Let me get my eraser tool. So you can go in and start tracing out those flat faces that you can see. Like, okay, I can see that there's at least 3 flat faces on the front of this. And then in an implied other 3 flat faces on the other side of it, which is where these little points areas on the back come from. Is that implied, like, what is on the front very clearly needs to be on the back, because it's a cylinder. And then for this one, the little 20-sided die, you do the same thing. You draw out the faces. And understanding that like the shadows indicate where all of those faces are, even if the object has like a design on it or whatever. As long as you can see and understand where the shadows are to understand what the faces are doing. So there you go. That's how you do the like super complicated shapes. And that would lead us into shadows. So you've got the complicated shapes. You've got your things traced out. This one is very complicated. We got it traced out. We got the understanding of the faces. Now we have to understand how lighting is hitting it. So let's bring our little trace down. Or if you're doing this on paper, you would take a kneaded eraser or just an eraser in general and erase very, very lightly your pencil work so that you can still see what you drew, but it is light enough for you to continue working on top of it. Or if you're tracing on a piece of paper like I had suggested, get a different color of pen or pencil that you're working with to outline the shadows now. Get a red color going. So we're looking at our shapes. We understand that in these more complicated ones, we already kind of mapped out where all the shadows were. So right now we're looking for shadows that are within the same shade range. So the darkest areas that we can find. And we're only worried about the shapes themselves. We don't have to worry about the background just yet. Maybe come up here too. And we're just roughing out where all the shadows are on these shapes. And I want to do it on the shapes themselves because we'll get to the shadows behind the shapes a little bit later. I guess this one also has a shadow on it. And then let's do another color for the shadows on the ground. So the basic concept for shadows that are on the ground, they will more often than not be the same like color tone. So if you're just starting out drawing and you want to do shadows on things, you can have it kind of be the same tone and get away with it just fine. I'll go into shading again on another lesson, but right now we're just understanding shapes and the basics of shading right now. So things like bounce light and like just brighter areas against darker areas, we will cover that in a different lesson. But right now we're just getting the basics of how to look at a still life and how to draw it down. For like floor shading, just have it kind of be one piece right now. But for the shading that is on the shapes that we just traced out, one of the things that I do as a trick is cut them into 3 sections. And in this one's case, this 3 sections are here. So for these 3 sections, the cylinder is kind of easiest to kind of see. All of them have at least a little bit of shading. Then there's like a middle, kind of darker bit of shading, and then the darkest shading is against the back. And that's my basic explanation of how to do shadows on things. Usually there are 3 sections of shadow. There's the mid-tone. No, this one would be mid-tone. I forget the specific terms for it. But I usually cut it into 3s of like the highlight would be here, your base color would go all the way down, and then you would start doing the shading of like the lightest one would be the first one, mid one, and then darkest. And that will get you the closest to looking at these and being like, okay, I can see where the shadow kind of starts and stops. I guess the images being pretty crusty and being very low quality does help in this instance of you can literally see the pixels like carving out this 3 layered method that I'm talking about, especially on the spheres. Now, this one is having some bounce light on it. We're coming back to that a little bit later, but just for right now, we're only focusing on the 3 layers that we are talking about. So darkest, mid, and light. And then eventually you will do like a highlight on this side. Should I have researched terms before doing this to give you accurate art terms? Maybe. But also, this is meant to be a beginner course, so if you don't know what you're doing, then you don't know the terms either, so you can't tell me that I'm not doing it right. That's how you do your shadows. Just very quick, I'll make another lesson that's very specific about shadows and like why stuff like this is happening. Where light is bouncing off the block behind it and how to kind of predict that. But we are going into, I just want to draw a still life. How do I draw said still life? Well, we can give some examples. So we can go back to tracing what we did before. Some actual still lives. To give an example, so we have circle, 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 a little bit of an oval, and then a bunch of more circles. And then we got an oval that's cut off at the top. Do this so you can see it better. And we got a cylinder that's a little bit wonky because we'll say that it's a cylinder that has a cylinder on top of it that tapers just lightly. So the way that you would understand this would be the same way that you would understand this one. But this one down here is a lot more complicated, especially since it blends into the background. And this would be an instance where you would kind of trace it out to figure out the shape that's going on. So what do we do with that? It's a very complicated jug. So technically the bottom part is just a big circle. Not that you see it a whole bunch. But that's all it is. And then the neck area you could consider a cylinder. Ooh, a wonky little arrow. So all it is a cylinder that has a little neck on it. And then the handle is complicated. I don't know how to explain for the handle. I mean, it's the same thing as like the stem on the apple. It's kind of decoration that you'll get into when you're drawing it. And it would also be like the top of the bottle up here, which would be like a rectangular shape. And then next of what you would do once that you kind of have your trace of these would be finding the shadows again. Some of these are a little bit difficult because this one technically goes like this way, even though all of the shadows on the rest of them are going the opposite way. That is purely because the orange is tilted that direction, like into everything. But for beginners, this basically has no shadow other than the one behind it. But we're getting there. Recognizing where the shadow is, and then following the 3 sections. I guess this one would come out a little bit more. Yeah. Darkest section, midsection. And the same thing down here. We would start getting into the more complicated shapes because there's one there. Darken it up so you can see it. And then each one of the grapes would also have its own. And there we go. And then for the actual shading, you can take your pencil and just kind of fill in all of that area. Darken it in this last section that we have carved out. And then you can take your eraser and lighten the area in the first section. Not completely gone, but enough that it is a little bit lighter. You can do that for basically all of these. Go back over darkest section one time, then take your eraser, and then lightly erase the other section, or the first section in the third. And you just do that for all of the shapes. But make sure to keep an eye on the reference image itself, especially for this jug, because you would assume with all of these other ones that you are erasing this direction. And especially on the side of the jug as well. But when you actually look at the bottom image, you're actually erasing the opposite direction here. Because the light is coming from this direction, this lip is higher and casting a shadow down. So the light only hits it over here rather than the direction that the light is coming from. So the lip of this jug gets in the way of the lighting coming in to the object. But every other spherical object is fine. So you just continue filling in each one. And then come in with your eraser and erasing away that first third section. Now you have the basics of shading. Now again, this is very specifically with these kind of easy still lifes, where everything still is pretty round, spherical, cylinder-esque. Going in with the details usually becomes easier once that you have all the shadows. I forgot to do the shadows behind it, but I had said before that the shadows behind it, as long as you understand like where the light is coming from, what shape, the light coming from up here is very, very high, and so the shadow underneath all of these items are going to be very close to the item itself. And all of the shadows underneath these items are going to be this same darkest tone, so you don't need to do any kind of like shading for that area. And then for down here, again, a very high light source. So you're just following the shape that this is making to then have it be the shape that is on the ground. You just shade it in with that same amount of pressure as the darkest point on the item itself. And that's how you get your shadows underneath it. And another way that you can think about like how the shadows are going to look down here is like cutting a line around where you had done the shadows usually will be the same shape that the shadow itself down here will be. This one's a bit more complicated because the light source is a little bit forward, so it's appearing on the wall back here. And that would be an instance where you're using the trace method that I've been giving you to your advantage of, like, how is the light really interacting with this piece back here? If you don't fully understand it, just being able to draw it and recognize it back here is a good start, but it definitely doesn't fit the line method that I was giving here. That mostly works for rounded objects, spherical objects. But we can go into something a little bit more complicated, or we can look into darker shadows. Items that are a little bit more obvious of where the shadows kind of start and stop. Shadows really would be like all the way into here. And then the darkest tone would be all the way back here. And then mid-tone. And you can see it really well on this orange. With like the darkest tone being there. When going in and doing the fill-in method. And then taking your eraser and softening this whole area. And then you would go in with your highlight and just kind of circle the tops of everything. I didn't talk about highlight, but it is literally just what is the highest point on all of these, and just use your brightest color or if you're doing it with pencil, you would fill in, like, you would just kind of fill in all the way up to that point and just erase completely where the highlight is so that the white of the paper will act as your highlight. And yeah, taking all this stuff. This is the darkest point. Highlight is here, so midtone is like that. And then you would take your eraser at the highlight point, and that's where you would erase down the shadows and stuff. That is my quick lesson on how to do still lifes and shapes, trying to make it as easy to understand for a beginner as possible, and then giving a real life complicated example. This is just a little setup in my office. I wanted to give a real example that isn't just like very simple shapes of what do you do with all of this. We will identify the shapes. We got a very easy circle here. Another pretty simple circle here. And a not so easy to spot, but a circle here. Wrist is a circle. The palm of the hand is basically an oval. And then we can start looking for cylinders. Face of the skull would be considered a cylinder. Another cylinder would be the top of the little crocheted bomb. And the wrist of the mannequin back here, as well as all of the fingers, would be considered little cylinders. And then jewelry box is just a big rectangle. And when it comes to like starting out for the first time, you don't need to do every single little detail. Like you can get really carried away with drawing everything on the top of this little mini dresser thing up here. And it's going to get real complicated and real tedious, and that's where a lot of people lose interest in doing still lives like these, is because they get very overwhelmed with the amount of things on their still life. And it's just like, I have to keep drawing so many drawers, so many little knobs, that I don't want to draw this anymore. Or they'll look at the texture of the crochet and be like, there's so many little lines and little textures that I don't know how I'm ever going to like finish doing all of these little textures. Don't do them. We're not doing that. All we're doing is finding the big shapes. That's a big shape. That's easy enough to understand. It's another rectangle. We erase the line behind it. And we don't draw these little things, all the little beads and all the complicated things in the still life. We don't need to draw them. Right now we're just understanding how to get the basics of a still life. And then from there, we understand the shadows. So we look at it, find all the darkest shadows, This counts as a shadow back here. That is a very complicated shape, but I believe in you. And again, for these complicated shapes, that's why we are tracing first to understand how to do the still life before just going to pen and paper. And then do the sectioned method. Where you're looking for the darkest and lightest points. And you're just filling them in the same way. Then taking the eraser and erasing along the edge. Now I didn't do the entire still life here just now, but it gives you a basic understanding of how to go about your first steps of drawing a still life. And then from those shapes, once you kind of get a clear understanding of like where they all sit within the piece, that's when you can start going into the like nitty-gritty details of like where the teeth are, where the edge of the bones are, and where all the cracks and stuff are. But you do that like after you get like everything kind of blocked out, all the shadows kind of blocked out. I wouldn't go super hard with some of the dark areas, just like in case there are situations with like, oh, the pumpkin kind of is here, but I messed up with having a dark shadow here. It also doesn't really matter at the end of the day. You're just doing practice. If you want it to be perfect, trace it a couple of times. Do this method on several pieces of paper until you transfer it to something else. And then take all those shapes that you know because you trace them. And then you can get started on officially drawing it without needing to trace. Because you've taken your time to sit down and look at it and break it down piece by piece. There you go. You've got the very basics of putting down your still life. And then from there you can do the shading. And there, you have already started your still life. It already looks like what you are trying to draw. And then you can worry about going into the tiny details after you get to this point, where you're just like, oh hey, now that I am looking at this, I know that the finger joints look more like this. That they're a little bit more rounded. And they're a little bit more complicated than what I initially have here. And also I can notice that there is a fingernail that's carved into that, so now I can start adding those little details to it. Or even like with the skull of like, now I can kind of focus on these little details. And there's this like spring that's here. And there's like the seam that goes around the head. And you can follow the map that you've already set out for yourself on where everything sits, because you've already done all of the shapes that you've seen from this one. So now everything isn't going to be just kind of floating in space, because a lot of people will like heavily focus on like, oh, the bomb is really funny, so I want to make sure that I draw the bomb perfectly correct. And then once that they do that, it's like, oh, but maybe the candle is a bit over here, But no, that's too much space in between this, so where is the corner of the box and stuff? And things start kind of like floating away of just like, oh, but I really want to start drawing the eye of the skull. And it's like, ooh, the nose. And then they'll get to like the jawline and it's like, oh wait, but the jawline needs to be up here. And now it's all the way down here. How do I get it back over there? But I already spent all this time drawing this much. And when you have when you focus on doing shape like this, you won't have that problem. You'll be able to understand where everything kind of like sits together. A lot better, and be able to space everything out a lot better when you do the tracing method to understand where everything is, to then place it officially on the page without even thinking about it, really. And that's how you do still life. And definitely if you decide to try out drawing this still life, you put it on the screen for a hot second if you guys want to take a screenshot of it. Tag me if you work on this specific still life with all the tips that I just gave you. Tag me on Instagram, anywhere, really, and let me see what you did. Now, let's move on to how shapes interact with, hold on, I gotta organize my stuff. How shapes are used in character design, because I'm pretty sure that's what a lot of people really want to know. A lot of people are very excited about doing character design and stuff. So let's talk about shape language first. Shape language. It's when you integrate specific shapes into your characters. Now, a lot of people thinking of a baker will just kind of like do the best that they can with the anatomy that they know. But when you add in shapes to the character design, the personality becomes something completely different. Rectangle shapes will usually come across as very, very strong, very bulky, very solid. Round shape will come across as very soft, very calm. And then triangular shapes can come across as very intimidating, very sharp, very angular, very cut off. And this can be easily seen in Disney films of like Jafar has a lot of triangle shapes. The Sultan has very round shapes. And Aladdin, interestingly enough, has a combination of triangle and circular as being kind of an anti-hero idea. And then you can integrate like other kind of shapes, like Genie is overall a big circle, but because of his fluidity, he has a tail to him. And that is just added to his circular shape of making sure that he is always in fluid movement, in circles. So spirals are considered like circular as well. And then when it comes to carpet, it's a rectangle, but it's a rectangle that is also always in motion, always in curves, so that the concept of the round softness is still within this rectangular, strong kind of character. And that is how they are using shape language within the character designs here. And bringing that into, like, characters that we know of, like, a lot of these have those same fundamentals of, like, Hilda is very round. We want round shape to show innocence. We want round shape to show softness. Bimo is rectangular, being that they are a video game, but also they have rounded edges to kind of bring in that softness, to kind of bring back that like circular kind of existence, but not going too far away from the like solid like rectangle concept of it. But then there's big triangle characters like Aku, where like every point in this character is all just triangles in one singular rectangle of like solid but dangerous, solid but triangular. And that like Maleficent is another good like Disney character that uses this exact same like layout of the triangular kind of character design, but then like a solid face, something to like land on, that this is what you're meant to kind of like rest at. I do not have Maleficent as a reference pulled up here, but you can understand kind of what I'm saying. And then from there, getting into more art styles that I assume people are more interested in kind of pulling it into is more humanoid looking characters. You can still see with Steven Universe-esque characters of the circles, the solid rectangles, while also having circles. The triangles. And another circle. And each one of the characters having this shape language kind of puts into perspective of what their personality is. Pearl is very like rigid, very angular in the way that she thinks. Garnet is very solid, very strong in the way that she thinks. And Amethyst is very soft, very round in the way that she thinks, very like fluid. The same way with the genie from earlier, that always has this like curl going on to show fluidity and roundness to their character. Thus, Amethyst having long hair adds that rounded fluidity, which adds on to her laid back kind of persona. And then going into like adult Steven, you're pushing the original kind of character design into more human-esque qualities of, yes, he is still like circular, but also he is becoming older, he's a lot taller, he's adding more rectangles to his design, thus he is more solid. Mentally solid, you can come to that conclusion on your own, but standing solid is definitely there. And then we can push it even more with character design going into all of the other characters. You can see the same kind of conversation of like triangles versus rectangles versus circles, of like who is meant to have this like solid idea. Now, some people could argue with Rose of being a triangle or being a circle, but I think that is the point of her character design for the shape language, is that you would initially think that she is a circle, but at the end of the day, she is still just a triangle, which could show her like rigidness and like cutting off of characters and stuff. I think this specific pose is very intentional in showing that triangular kind of look to her. And that also matches, like, her backstory and stuff like that. And even Lapis, who you would assume would be a circle, is still very triangular, very angular, and, like, very sharp in her design. Which I think could represent still Homeworld within her. And later on in the show, she adapts more, like, oval qualities once that she kind of gets further and further away from Homeworld. And then we have some other kind of character designs that kind of lean away from the literal shape and just lean into more, like, what are things that we can do, like, with characters to have them still be, like, humanoid, but also just play with proportions. You got Craig that's got a lot of ovals on his design. But the bodies are all still pretty rectangular at the end of the day. And that is just a stylistic choice of rectangles. Circles and rectangles. Now, I don't think that the same kind of shape language in Steven Universe really applies to Craig, but I just want you to notice the way that shapes are being used to make these character designs. If you don't want to be very literal in the shapes of your characters, you can still use shapes to, like, recognize how to create characters. Where you've got, like, a bunch of ovals that are coming together. To create this character, and then this, like, bell shape for the body. And I would say that Craig seems to be going with the, like, line curve method that is very complementary to one another. It kind of leans into more, like, anatomy stuff. Because if you look on, like, human bodies, there's always, like, D curves everywhere. Like, she's a good example of, like, a D curve. That it's not necessarily the same as what Steven Universe is doing. Now, D-curves are still used in Steven Universe, certainly, but the shape language of the way that all of these characters are designed is not the same as Craig is being used. Because the rectangles for the male characters versus the circles for the female characters, I don't believe is trying to convey the same language that Steven Universe is trying to convey with their shape language. So this would be the midpoint into people who are wanting to do character design that's more into, like, She-Ra stuff. Vox Machina, more complicated, like, proportion-based character designs rather than shape-based character designs. Now, I will go into a different course that is specifically about anatomy and proportions and how to make them more complicated and how to make them less complicated. But I just really wanted to sit down for this first one and get you into thinking about things as shapes, especially when it comes to still life. because still life is the thing that everyone starts with. Everyone starts with still life, and I heavily encourage everyone to do still life. Even though it is a little bit boring, you gotta find things that you find really interesting when it comes to these. And if you are only interested in character design, find one of these cartoons, Cartoon Network cartoons that have these stylized kind of bean-shaped heads. I know everyone is tired of the bean-shaped heads, but they are the easiest to understand how shapes are being used to create characters. And I think getting used to doing this will get you closer to understanding anatomy, which again I will do another course specifically on that, of how to where to start and stop for like shoulders to elbows to wrists. But I will get into that for the lesson specifically on anatomy. This one is just for shapes, and I hope this overall helped you get started with understanding how to look at things in shapes and to measure things out with still lives. Get started with looking at the shows and art styles that you really like and understanding how these artists are using shape to create these character designs. And yeah, that's kind of all I had for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something and you can go into drawing with a little bit more understanding of how to do so. Like and subscribe. Because I am going to continue doing lessons like this. I'm going to continue just building up into very, very specifics, into a lot more complicated things, but I really wanted to start with the very basics of shape and shading so that you can start taking photos of still lives yourselves and be able to come back and be like, all right, I know how to do these kind of like drawings and stuff like that. Now I want to start putting like muscle behind what I am drawing. And that lesson on that will be coming very soon. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for learning.